Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we continue with our cryptid submissions. This one is sent in by Dan Omega. Actually came in on July 26th. Excellent stories. Actually sounds somewhat Lovecraftian at parts. Very well written. So we're going to jump into his story. And believe me, it's quite a tale. And before we do that, though, if you have an effed up story of your own and you'd like to submit that and get it into a podcast, go to effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the submissions link, fill out the form, hit submit. We'll get it on the website and into a podcast. And with that having been said, we're going to jump into Dan Omega's story. By the way, on the website, it's called Subterranean Predator. So, if you want to read it there, that's the title. And now we're going to start. So, as Dan puts it, he grew up in an extremely small town on the fringes of northern Ontario wilderness. When the town, of course, was still in its infancy, and for all intents and purposes, barely out of its pioneering days. He has to keep the name of this town private, and for reasons that he'll outline, and I'll read that as we get to it. But he's going to call the city, or reference the city in this story, as the city of Southern Cross. The outskirt town within which he lived was called, and again, this is a quoted name, I guess fictitious, Sunrise Valley. And he said the entire town is a low-lying valley basin. Country roads, dirt roads, roads that went to nowhere and stopped as dead ends to be continued as trails into the woods and forest. Many of them generations old and from the settlement days of horses and wagons. Many paved roads had lights spread far apart with huge gaps in between. Much of it, in pockets, looked like vestiges of frontier towns of the Old West. A lot of dust, dirt, and gravel in those stretches. There were ghost towns and the husks of old structures and buildings and old foundations here and there. It was largely rural outside of the city proper and again surrounded by huge tracts of wilderness, the remains of old farms dotting the landscape. Like I said, he wrote this really well. So at this time, he said he lived in north of Southern Cross. Again, a fictitious place, or name for the place, but which was also very small and barely developed. And this was in one of the satellite towns. Much of the region, extreme Canadian Shield landscape, all around the main city, like an epicenter, was barren, blighted, and scourged, as well as literally burnt by industrialization, both inside the city and remote areas. Industrialization had basically taken this town over. There were rocky high hills and mounds and blasted wilds sudden tracks of desert dunes, and dead bleached trees like skeletons as far as the eye could see. It was like an atomic bomb had gone off 1,000 years before. Quite factually, life of all kinds had been decimated there. Plants, animals, entire ecosystems of various sorts murdered by the machineries of the progress that they had made. Death had come to those places, and it looked like that in many places they walked and explored was just a graveyard. So, to the east of Sunrise Valley, there was a massive impact crater lake, for which there were all kinds of stories, some by the native First Nations peoples, some not. The weather over that lake could suddenly and viciously change, which he had experienced firsthand on a few occasions, coming close to the watercraft we were in and nearly getting swamped and drowned by the sudden change in weather. He said there are known, scientifically proven gravitational and magnetic anomalies surrounding the valley and the lake. The depth of it is listed as not specifically known. It's known to be very, very deep, and many people had died there. A native First Nations community right now lives on its shores. So to Dan, the land was beautiful and fascinating, even in its desolation. And he explored it very much so. In fact, from what I gather, I've seen some of Dan's postings. I have him on my Facebook. He seems to do a lot of exploring. It's one of his things. And so, he was very fascinated by this strange, kind of creepy, but yet beautiful landscape. And he said Sunrise Valley was a mix of farming, greenery, vegetation, and the scars of industrialization. It was and is also geologically very complex, a landscape of very strange contrasts, and often has a strange feel to it, with ancient creek beds cutting through it. Underground caverns of all kinds are known to exist beneath it, some of which are accessible, and most are not accessible by normal means. You would find anomalous spots in areas that were completely foreign to everything around in the middle of nowhere. Quite literally, it was a plot of land like a separate drop in the wilds around it. You'd find yourself in a lush, steamy, jungle-like site with a rich swamp or pond when surrounding it with a near visible boundary, marking where the rest of nature continued. Or in the forest, straight of like a fairy tale, you would stumble upon a sand dune in the middle of all of it. By this, you just stumble into this thing that would be all around these narrow desert brush. The wild woods to the north were deep, and what he said are truly boreal forests. But this is setting the stage. This is the place where he lives. So getting to his story, he moves out to the Sunrise Valley, which is in the middle of the Southern Cross place, and he was 6 when they first moved there, and they moved because he almost died on his birthday in an accident right around where he lived, and I guess they just needed to start over, and they apparently had to change his name. They had to protect his identity. Anyway, so he was there. He said that his grandparents had come from the old country, Slavic Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, etc. He was surrounded with the feeling of the old country and the old ways, old traditions, foods, gardening, fruits, vegetables, herbs, roots, spices, wild berries, and then, of course, vast miles of wilderness to explore with wild abandon. Superstitions and folklore were rife in his bloodline. There had also been a history to his family which had been partially hidden and partially forgotten, which he was to learn later on. A dark blot in his family's history, which, for whatever reason, he would be the one to uncover, partially through the use of psychics and mediums that came into the city core years later, barely tolerated and heavily marginalized. Because of this family history, there was a shadow and a sorrow, bitterness that ran through his family following him from the old place where he came from. He developed an interest in what he'll call the esoteric, right from his earliest memories. which his family looked down upon, by the way. And he became, compared to any other children that he knew of in the town, very knowledgeable in this esoteric knowledge. And he spent a lot of time out in the wilderness and the hills, wandering the woods for hours and hours at a time, and becoming quite strong and sometimes unkempt looking in the process. All these facts very quickly put a mark on his head, because in many ways, by basically everybody he knew, including his own family, he became the black sheep. Or as he put it, maybe, perhaps, the black goat would be a more proper term. He had a small group of friends, the eclectic weirdo, bookworm pack of the town, but they were in it for the adventure and fun. They enjoyed these strange adventures, and they were curious people. They wanted to poke and prod. They wanted to explore. Dan said he was in it for much more than that. He was marginalized even among these strange group of people, but they gave him a small, tight tribe to be part of, so he suffered through it, and there were many conflicts and infighting within that pack because of that, but, more or less it was better for him. So because of all these factors, and because he lived a very, very secretive life, like some of the things that he delved into that was esoteric, he was kind of, in a little bit of a way, a black sheep, I guess, within his group of friends. He said later in his teens, there appeared to be a cult of black magic users in Sunrise Valley where he lived, and a very serious cult enacting many horrible acts, like ritualistic animal sacrifices were found. Animals had gone missing, and this was a big deal for this small town. There was a lot of talk about it, and he believes that the cult came there because the town was in its early stages of development, and they were drawing power from the land, consecrating it for the future usage, and certain people were being given power to put in positions of influence. Despite Dan's complete innocence, he wasn't part of this cult or whatever. He was the immediate suspect, according to him, and he said, and was followed unbeknownst to him. He was investigated under surveillance for many years. He said, like, there were town meetings were held, and he was basically brutally and eventually interrogated by the police in Southern Cross, as if he was the one behind all of these animal sacrifices and the one at the head of this cult. And the way he put it was, he was a scapegoat, and for these witch hunts that you've basically heard of, like similar to Salem, right? And that's what kind of took place in these small outskirts where he lived. It was a witch hunt for who was responsible for these animal sacrifices, and the townspeople wanted Dan strung up. And he said no one else knew what he knew, had the interest he had. He was kind of weird. He was into these weird esoteric things, and therefore he must be the one that's behind all this stuff. Of course, Dan says that that's not the case. But anyway, he was suspected, apparently, after all their investigations, by the highest members of the police force to be the regional high priest in a national black satanic / death cult. He was a witch that they wanted to burn. And the group he was with was his cabal, and he was apparently instructing him. That's what the public and the police thought. He said that they were all convicted in the eyes of the townspeople, and more than the others, him specifically, he was branded and attacked, and the rumors spread like hellfire. He said there were some that wanted to ostracize him, some that wanted to drive him and his family out of the town, and some that wanted to expose him. Some wanted him in the hospital, some wanted him dead, others wanted him in prison, and still others wanted him damned. So this is, he emphasizes, this is no exaggeration. He was truly a target in this town for something that he wasn't responsible for, simply because he was into the esoteric subjects. So, he said it was a village witch hunt. He was innocent. He adored nature. He adored animals and wildlife. They wanted his head on a platter, but, he got through it because he was smart. So this is why he wishes to mask and alter names. He said the city and the town, if he were to go into more detail, it would be very easily identifiable, especially by those villagers that lived there. And, they would literally take this account really close to home. He just doesn't want to drum up any drama. So into Dan's main tale here. Basically, it was a series of events that took place, some years after this whole him being ostracized by his town. But anyway, he said after the Southern Cross had heavily expanded and developed, he had returned to the larger city after years of living abroad in these various little cities. And he said, like a black hole, it drew him back into its folds. He said he almost died in its borders several times, and by all accounts, he should be buried there. He said he was in his early 20s at the time, and he was living with a friend in a loft right in the city close to one of the many lakes, and interestingly, completely randomly close to a site overlooking the city used for outdoor Catholic and Masonic religious ceremonies. It was a historical section of the city as well, and in any case, he had returned from abroad and had spent the summer there, a summer of tremendous excess and, just living it up in the elements. He said the summer was falling away now, and it looked like, they would do this, a glorious Indian summer going forward into the equinox and autumn's arrival. And one night at this time, he crossed paths with someone he refers to, and again, this is a quoted, a name that he's keeping hidden, but he refers to her as Missy, and she was a practicing white witch. And she had come to her interest in the wave of alternative interest and esoteric leanings that had washed into the city in the years following Dan's time as the scapegoat that, kind of slipped out of the noose, and years of the, out of the noose of these years of unsolved sacrificial killings. So, Missy was a typical tall, slender, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned white witch. And when he met her, he should say when he met her again, because she had actually lived in a borough in the neighborhood that he grew up in, but, they weren't, they obviously weren't close at that time. Coming to her interest, like they shared this interest after the fact, and he said, for Dan, his interest consisted in more of a melding of light and dark, after, this kind of a thing, and she was more into the white magic. But he said after a whirlwind of romance, of really becoming acquainted for the first time, but knowing who each of them were, because they've seen each other in the neighborhood, they decided that they would cross the U.S. border and go backpacking together. Grassroots, taking buses, cabs, trains, hitchhiking, walking and then hiking for months to the Appalachian Mountains. And, they had never discussed Dan's interests, really. Like, they never dove into it. And the reason is simple, is that even with her, even with these common interests, Dan was a very secretive person. He really didn't want to let too much of himself out. No one was ever privy to that side of him. And he said many of the things that he saw and experienced were for his eyes only. He said some of these experiences were purposely induced. Others, like unexpected shots out of the blue or the black. But in either case, they planned this trip quickly and excited to embark into the unknown. They were excited to know each other more. And on their last night in the city, they decided that, a group of them, and we're going, he refers to these again as the old friends. And, this, by the way, was who the cops believe were the suspected cabal. Dan, Missy, and this group they would go out into the wilderness and have a nighttime gathering and bonfire, just outside the town limits of Sunrise Valley. And this was quite a distance to the north, and it was a place that they knew well, but was new to Missy. So everybody else kind of knew where this place was. And it was a cliff or a precipice far away from the town that looked out for miles and miles of woodlands, lakes, rolling hills, a view all the way to the far-off twinkling Southern Cross. The series of cliffs were called the Phoenix Bluff, and across it was another called Crow's Nest. And this is where crows and ravens would congregate, a beautiful sight in the setting sun when the cliffs were painted red. There was an old, small dirt road that led to the trailhead winding up to it, and you could look down from it and see the dirt road. You could see your vehicle parked up there from up on this precipice, or anyone that was approaching. It was also good for catching sounds below because, the rocks, the way they were formed, the sound would kind of just travel up there. And in any case, the group that were there before them, the group was there before Dan and Missy, and they were setting up the fire, the camp, the food, the drink, etc. And they were just a group of lads that they loved the outdoors, and they spent a lot of time out there, and they would go for miles and miles and miles. And he said this place went for miles and miles and miles, and it was a no man's land, and it had predators in it. And we're speaking, of course, mainly of animal life, but of course there's going to be more than that. And so in many, they never had any weapons with them, or forget that, they had many weapons. I said the opposite of what I meant to say. They would carry weapons with them because they didn't know what they were going to run into in the woods. And they said that they would take every kind that they could carry with them. And they were savage looking, they were I guess a lot of knives and stuff like that. And he said they weren't afraid to use them. Some of these weapons were legal, and yes, some completely illegal. When they were young and living where they did at the time they did, it was like living in the South on the outskirts of Hazard County. So almost anything went. It was a dangerous place to be anyway. And he said, again, almost like a frontier town, just coming out to its settlement days. This was it was an unsafe place to be. So they were very used to being in places where they might not have walked out again, in hindsight. So he's surprised that they did every time. Sometimes they were cut, bruised, and bleeding, but they got out. They were lucky. So anyway, Missy and Dan arrived just after dark. It was a little late, and everything was well underway. He said he could see the bonfire up high on the bluff, and in those parts, you can see and hear a car approaching for miles and miles, especially in the dead of night on a Phoenix Bluff. He said, we unloaded the car, prepared to make their way up and join in with their friends, and they marveled at the intense canopy of the stars over them, but especially where they were. You could really see the Milky Way, out of town without the light pollution. And, it was just a real sight to take in. And he said, exiting the car and climbing up on the trail, with the flashlights, he could hear the sound of wolves howling in the distance. And he said, him and the guys, they had encountered wolves before growing up in very close proximity, but, he certainly made note of it in any case. It's still a dangerous situation to be in. So when he got to the top of the bluff and the ledge where everyone was sitting around the bonfire, he mentioned that wolves had started howling just before they arrived. And despite that they were well armed and they were on high ground and they had a large fire in front of them, with a large pile of kindling and firewood, and having experience and, dealing with the wildlife in the area, they went on. They were cautious, but they went on with the night festivities. He said, he listened to them, though, the whole time as they did. He could hear the wolves around them during the whole evening. And he said the night sky was crystal clear. The stars were beautiful, and he couldn't see any moon on that night, but at the same time, he could hear the howling from these wolves, and it was incessant. And there was many of them. He said he thinks it was a large pack, probably 7 or 8. And he said it was around, there were around 10 of them, including 3 women. And, perhaps they should have been more concerned, but maybe they should have been a little bit more cautious. But in hindsight, we probably should have toned down the activity and been more aware, but they just didn't. They just did their thing. And he said, they had experienced a similar occurrence years before during a lunar eclipse on a completely different lookout cliff while camped on the ledge overhead, overlooking a lake, and seeing their eyes shine glinting below in the forest in the beams of their flashlights. So, they've kind of experienced this before, and I guess they were a little bit cocky. And, so he said he always had this kind of kinship with the people there because of this, and he said that he was never averse to putting up a ring of protection around him anyway. They weren't really concerned unless there was really a reason to be concerned. So to them, that really literally meant an actual attack. So he was also carrying a very large, heavy, homemade machete/falchion type sword blade. So he felt kind of safe with that, and him and his friends had taught and picked up blacksmithing when they were young. They were, really into this stuff, and they apparently had forged an armory of insane weapons straight out of history, like the Dark Ages, including a Morning Star mace. So I guess they were packing some medieval stuff up there. He said he had a 5-foot metal tip bladed spear. He had a hatchet on his hip, and as well as a Bowie knife in his deep pocket. He was very athletic, practiced martial arts as well as some weapons. So he wasn't someone who identifies with experiencing fear. To him, it was more of an excitement. He kind of enjoyed it. Despite that, looking back on it, he knows that he could have died, he could have been disemboweled, but he was confident, if nothing else. So, as these wolves were getting closer and howling and moaning and yipping, it was getting louder. He started paying close attention, and again, almost in fascination, welcoming them, almost looking forward to this possible conflict. And he was hyper aware of their presence and movement more than anyone else in the group. He said he kept his weapons gripped and more than ready to just jump up and get into the fight with these things. And he said he kept an eye on Missy, who strangely seemed slightly oblivious and slowly moved from one spot to the other on the shelves and ledges, listening and watching. He said he didn't really think beyond that, just thought of the moment, the thrill of what's going on. And, he really wasn't afraid to die. He was just excited by all of this. And he said that there was a coincidence and a connection with the wolves and, canids in their explorations. He said even when he arrived and he heard them as they were leaving the car, he felt this same sensation. And then he would hear them rustling in the brushes and the bushes below, or what he assumed were wolves anyway. And, he shot rocks off in their directions where the rustlings were, just hand-sized rocks. And, that was their thinking, that, they would just scare these things away. It had always worked before. And anyway, or they would make noise, clinking their metal together. And he knew that, these animals instinctively recognized the sound of metal, and that it was a mortal threat to them, and that they would, more or less run off most of the time. So he said that at this time, autumn was near, and with that, harvest and hunting season, which all wildlife instinctively recognizes. And he said they can also smell metal, especially iron and similar metals. Oiled iron, they can taste it in their smell. The tang is so strong to them. And he knew that, they identified that as a mortal danger to them as well. So, he really wasn't scared of this. He would shout out, he would throw rocks, he would smack his weapons together, and he would assume that they would go away. And he said he had a voice that really carried. He threw his voice, just letting them know that, There's danger for them if they come up. But uncharacteristically, it didn't seem to dissuade them like it had before. He said tonight was different. They were going against instinct, and it hadn't been a hard summer on them. They weren't starving, but they weren't acting as usual. And he said, going against the obvious danger to them, they pressed on. And he said he could hear them drawing closer, hemming in, and more. He could see the leaves, branches, and bushes visibly moving, shaking in the beams of flashlight and the ambient glow of the bonfire. Loving them, he was ready to hack one of these things open. He was scared that it was going to come down to that, and perhaps a little excited. He said the excitement of fear is a quick teacher, which to him, whatever he saw, whatever appeared, would be chopped or speared open as soon as it entered his personal sphere of space. And he said, he wouldn't give it a chance. As much as he loved wildlife and stood in awe of it, he would defend himself tooth and nail against some of these things. And again, he'd even use a ring of protection, but none of these wolves ever directly appeared. He just heard the sounds, and he could hear them scudding around the rocks on the trail, and the rustling and the shaking of branches and leaves. So, he was just hearing these things. He could tell that they were getting closer, but he couldn't see anything aside from the little bits of movement in the brush. And he said, the vocalizations continued off and on, but in a weird braying. He said they had come in from far away in the hills, and he wondered why they had come such a distance, why they were so insistent. But nothing showed itself. Sounds, movement, no attacks, no growls of defiance or threatening. He said they relaxed a little but stayed vigilant. He said he kept a very careful watch, patrolling the area of their camp. They were there. The wolves were very near, but they couldn't see anything. They were just swallowed in darkness, using it to their advantage, watching, listening in the darkness. And he said he knew they were watching. He could feel them watch him, all of them. So he let them know that he kept watch too. He said, the time came when one of his friends needed supplies in the car, and he wasn't going to let his friend go alone, so he went down on the trail with him, weapons in both hands, flashlight also in one of them. He said he carried his weapons, including a firearm, and there were movement in the leaves, brushes, bushes, all the while that they were descending this trail, and it was so close. And he said it was completely calm that night, so calm that the smoke from the fire went straight up like a pillar and then slowly spread out, sinking down after a while to become like a haze over the treetops. So any movement was likely them and not the wind. He said he gripped his weapons ready, and he knew that his friend knew how to use his. And he had also forged his own weapons with his own hands. So, they were pretty prepared for this kind of thing. And said not to mention that this guy he was with was a crazy bastard. He said, as much friction as there always were between them, he knew that this was a guy that could handle himself. And he said they made their way down, picking along, and they got to the landing on the dirt road where the cars were. And he said the smell of the swamp was particularly ripe, despite the smell of the campfire. And he said he still wanted his friend to hurry up. There was something a little off. And he said they were obviously few in number and exposed, and they were on low ground surrounded by elevations and high rises. There was very slight illumination from the fire above, like an exceptionally dim infrared glow over everything. Moonless nights, and they were out, away from the city. It was very dark. He said his friend rummaged through the car, the interior lights casting more illumination on the area around them, and Dan kept serious watch, his eyes constantly scanning. He said his senses tuned in, listening, his head slowly turning here and there, twisting his torso to help all of those parts survey. He was talking, babbling on, and he'd wished he'd been quiet, and he often blabbed on, so he just concentrated on what he was doing, his eyes penetrating the dark. And suddenly, an incredibly ominous feeling washed over him, and electric jolts ran up his body like the primal instincts were screaming to him to look now. And he said he had experienced similar sensations before for different reasons, but this was very strong, overpowering and overwhelming. He said there was a large opening or cavity in the trees beyond the car, an alcove or space for cars to park or turn around and go the other direction on the road. Because it was old and narrow and wide enough for one car where, they were, and his eyes were drawn to that spot, he said it was just like a magnet. His eyes were drawn to it, and he was very unprepared for what he saw. He said in the dim radiance from the car's interior lights about 20 or 25 feet away, he saw a hulking form standing there. And he said it had a face high above the ground, and his, Dan's body clenched and every muscle flexed unstoppably. He said this form was tall, wide, thick, heavy, and dark, but its outline against the branches were very clear. He said its face, this is what he truly saw the features of, and what stood out to him. He said the contours of it, shaded and shadowed by the light, it was more than just a face, it was a visage, and no human being. He said etched, it appeared as if it was etched, carved out, and just eyes watching him, directly at him. He said they were dark, the wetness of them gleaming from the dim firelight, and then all he could see in the dark was its face, nothing else. Everything else blotted, blacked out, like a tunnel stretched from his eyes to its eyes, its visage. He said it looked like a mask hanging in the murk. Like so many things that are not of this world, he can barely describe it properly, and whenever you do see it, it's something of a shock. He said he was standing there, wrapped in the blackness and the shadows, watching them as he went through, his friend went through the car the whole time. And he said he never moved a muscle. He just watched. And more, he said he could see more to us, than the crude senses that they could pick up. He said he knew this instantly, that this thing could sense them, perceive them. It was intelligent. They were seeing things. It was seeing things beyond human perception. He said it moved with ease through the night, over the difficult terrain. He couldn't see the details of its eyes. He could only make out its basic features, but in locking eyes with it, and when he did, that's when that tunnel opened between them. And more, it looked down on him. Its height impressive, its face visage was very harshly boned again. It appeared as if it was etched. Its bone structure cut sharply with sharp edges, its cheeks, its jaw, its chin, and he could tell its skin was dark, perhaps like a dark gray or pewter color, while the rest of it was black, and if not black, then a very, very dark brown or dark brown mixed with black. He said its face visage looked like it was cut from stone, maybe due to the lighting, all of it coming to some bizarre concentrated point at its nose and sharp open nostrils. And he said this is exactly what he thought at the time, the feeling that truly pervaded him. And this is the best words he can come up with to describe it. And he has chthonic, which I took to be similar to Cthulhu. And he says this, he emphasizes this word several times. He said it appeared like it belonged to deep underground, and some subterranean system of black rocks and black running underground waterways cut into the rock, like it had come up from deep inside the damp of the earth. It had been standing there watching them. It did not expect that he would see it, but he could. And he said it was very clearly defined. His pupils, Dan's pupils were nearly fully dilated. He said his blood coursing, his heart pounding, and in an instant, he could tell and feel the power from this being emanating from it. He said it was an intense physical power and pure brute strength, and more, he knew that this creature could be on the both of them in a split second, that it could rip them apart with its bare hands, tear their heads from their bodies. It could cleave them apart if it wanted to. He said he stood there locked in place with it, not moving a muscle, a single millimeter to signal to provoke this creature. He said if he were a devil worshiper, as the good folk of their town had accused him of, he would have dropped down to his knees there and worshipped this hulking black devil from under the mounds. He would have prayed to it right there and bowed his head. He said its eyes could see in the dark. That much was clear. His friend kept talking, totally unaware, rummaging through the car during this whole thing. And Dan didn't want to tip him off in any way or cause him to make a wrong move that would have this entity attack them. He didn't want to tip him off to anything. And he said waves, streams of electricity were coursing through his body, adrenaline. And he was again witnessing the supernatural in flesh and bone this time. He was ready to fight and to die. He said his knuckles on his blade and spear must have been white. He was ready to swing for his life, and he was telling it, projecting to it, thinking it without thinking any word. You'll kill me, but I will wound you. Adrenaline was pumping through him, and he swears on his grandmother's life that he was standing as still as a statue, like it was the entire time. He said his eyes and head were on fire, frozen precisely in the position he was in the moment he sighted it. Its visage burned into his mind like black fire, standing there like that, like when you stare at the sun and its ghost is burned into your retinas after. He said his friend finished what he was doing in the car, still completely oblivious to everything that was going on, and not really paying attention to Dan or what he was doing or not doing. He said he kept talking and started walking back towards the base of the cliffs, and Dan's eyes did not leave this creature's face even for an instant. He said even when the lights went out on the car, and once the light dropped, he said in that deep, really dim infrared glow from the fire high above, he could still see this creature's face just staring. He didn't want to say anything or do anything that could alert his friend whatsoever, just in case that his friend might make a move that was anything out of the ordinary or normal. Anything that could provoke this creature. He said he wanted him to just keep doing what he was doing. And he said his own night vision was fully enhanced. He was fully dilated to the darkness around. And he said not wanting to be separated and there alone, even as a town accused devil worshiper, he said that he could perhaps cause his friend to turn around and ask a question. So he slowly walked backwards behind him so that he couldn't see him and his intense posturing in the mostly dark area around him. His flashlight, faced forward on the trail. And even as he walked slowly backwards with his eyes, on the spot where this creature was, he said that every muscle in his body was flexing as he moved. He was just completely tensed up. He said his entire body stayed flexed, moving in what martial arts calls dynamic tension, a very difficult discipline, and his blade kept forward towards this creature. He said he moved away step by step, aware of every position of his footing, facing this creature no matter where he had to step, turning his torso when he had to, turning his head only when he had to, and he kept this area centered in his sight. And eventually they reached the trees and the creature's face melted away. He said he walked sideways but kept his torso and head toward the precise direction of the hollow in that, in these trees, listening like a madman, his heart still pounding at a phenomenal rate. Purely the animal in him lit up. And he said there was no attack, there was no movement to him, no following that, he could pick up on. He said the wolves that were there now seemed to quiet. And he said, once they got atop the bluff, there was nothing. He didn't want to cause any ripple in anyone's actions or behavior. He didn't want any of the guys to grab their weapons and descend or shine lights down on the spot, which was visible from the cliff edge. He watched alone, stared down at the alcove. He scanned the dark landscape. The wolves either departed or stopped any activity, and he kept watch for hours after he'd got up there. And he never told his friend that he had descended with about what he'd seen. He said he wouldn't have believed him anyway. There's no way he would have. He said there was lesser events that had happened before, and he didn't believe that. So there was no chance that he was going to believe this. And he said, some of these events nearly touched the guy's nose. And, he had no faith in the supernatural, just an interest, a curiosity. And Dan said he never told anybody, not a soul. And he said, none of them would have believed him. And he said he just kept it as another one of his secrets, like so many others, because he was a true believer and they were not. And unless it had come and jumped in front of the fire, none of them would have believed. Unless they had seen it with their own eyes, none of them would have thought it possible. And Dan said he kept silent, thinking on it after, reliving it in his mind's eye. As in other cases, it's still there. It was something that had come up from far beneath the earth and moved easily in the darkness across harsh, dangerous terrains filled with predators. The wolves had heralded, maybe preceded its coming. They had accompanied it, and that was sure. There were some things, there are things that the Aboriginal First Nations elders call the Master of the Wilds, and perhaps this was it. He said he may have, been an advantage. It may have been an advantage that they carried iron, and a lot of it because iron holds power over many creatures of folklore and the supernatural, and it is a bane to some of them. So it seemed that it was just, whatever this creature was there just to watch them or inspect them. Like he would never have known that, he'd been watched for 20 or 25 minutes. Or perhaps it meant to take both or one of them when their backs were turned and we were walking back, to the trailhead. Dan hasn't been able to completely discern its intentions or purpose. Maybe it was there to kill his friend. Even in seeking additional counsel from psychics and seers, they've turned Dan away, sometimes demanding that he leaves. He said the Phoenix Bluff is a very special site and very unusual, geologically exceptional, with all kinds of odd curiosities in the stone, veins of crystal shot through and running inside of it, part of truly ancient geophysics and part of the larger formation. It's rich in precious metals, minerals, buried geodes, gemstones, and crystal, but it's all intermixed, buried in it, difficult if not impossible in some cases to access by normal means. There are many faults deep underground. It is personally sacred to him. Dan has had and have been there many, many times, drawn to it, and have spent many hours there, often alone, in a variety of capacities, having a tremendous respect and love for it. It seems like a site from another time, from the Stone Age, with giant monolithic slabs, monoliths, and pyroclastic formations, blocks, boulders, erratics, like something that literally a prehistoric winged creature would land on. Perhaps this is why it came to us that night, and the wolves, because the site, the bluffs, the massive hill mound that it rests on, is known to the creatures. And in the terms of the native people here, it's a place with monito, a mysterious presence inherent in it that pervades it, indwelling, setting it apart, often existing truly from another time or age, resonating both here and then at the same time, creating a feeling or sense about it. After examining the area more closely at a later time from the perspective of Phoenix Bluff and one of its higher rounded summits, Dan saw very clearly that a natural path of exposed rock and contours and topography of the land funneled in from far out into the surrounding hills into deep wilderness and led right down to that very spot. That alcove or hollow of the trees by the car parked on the side of the road, that very place where the creature had stood watching in the cover of the night. He had never noticed that before. It was obvious from a bird's eye view how a creature could cross the land, and where it stood, there was open space, the nook in the trees empty, something of an entrance or archway into the hills beyond, going into the trees and exposed rock and rough path that he just described. And judging by the trees around and the arching over it, this being was the size of a giant, standing approximately 9 feet tall or thereabouts. All the physical evidence confirmed it. Later, after the case, he'd gone there and checked it out, He said he's seen many things in his time, and this is one of them. All physical signs about it pointed to this confirmation. The very next day, the White Witch and Dan had left for their months of hiking into the Great Divide, the Appalachian Mountains, first along one of the Great Lakes, and the events encounters would not stop, and in fact intensified after the events. They would never speak again. And by the way, Dan did send in the story of their trek into the Appalachian Mountains as well. But that is the conclusion of this story, where he saw some strange creature. So, just to kind of summarize there, Dan is an outdoorsman, loves the outdoors, loves the esoteric. He was kind of ostracized by his community for the things that he liked, and was falsely blamed by the community and the police as being the head of a black magic cult.
And that in its own seems to indicate some, those kinds of suspicions don't just come out of anywhere. Like, to me, that seems like there is this overarching ominousness about the area, that there's something about that area that would put normal people in that kind of a headspace and say, you know what? Yeah, I think they are devil worshippers. They're not just peculiar young people. The very, very ominousness, the very strangeness of this area was enough to inspire these regular folk to, what amounted to a fucking witch hunt.
Well, you know what it reminded me of?
That has to be a pretty bizarre setting.
Oh, for sure. And small towns often do have interesting beliefs and I guess fears, right? But what it reminded me of, and I can't remember the actual name of this. I'm sure people will chime in the comments, but there was a real life case, like a murder case where, like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 kids or something like that, or maybe it was one. I can't remember, but they were murdered one night, and the police were trying to find out who did this. And of course, they really had nothing to go on. There was like some guy that showed up in a diner one night, and he was bleeding. I mean, he was in the bathroom, like they had called the cops, and I think like he had left before they had gotten there, or whatever the case was. That to me sounded like the culprit. But anyway, they were on a witch hunt for who did it, and there was these kids, these teenagers, and they were into metal, like Slayer and like that kind of thing. And man, the cops and all these people, they jumped on it. It's like, yeah, these are the guys who did it. And they were like, they worshiped the devil. And they based it all on the fact that they listened to this heavy metal music. And, again, you could call that esoteric for some communities, right? And, or taboo or whatever. And, man, like one of those guys, or a couple of them, went to jail. Like they actually got convicted on this. And I watched a movie, like I don't know, like within the last year anyway, that they had, had a reenactment of what actually happened, and it pissed me off so bad because that fucking judge was an idiot. Not trying to get too far off topic here, but anyway, you know what? They wanted someone to blame for this. And they didn't like these kids because they were different, and they blamed them. And it came out later that they were innocent, that they didn't even do it. And that's what I think of when I think of Dan here, with the, being blamed for being the head of this cult. Yeah, he's into some esoteric stuff, but I mean, really, you look at what he says, and just look at how he describes nature. This is a man who loves nature, and
very reverent.
Very reverent. And to me, I honestly, I feel like a lot of this need for weapons and to protect himself is just that. He feels the need to protect himself. I almost feel like from reading that if people never gave him such a hard time and judged him throughout his life for this kind of stuff, that, you know, he might not have ever gotten into that. He just sounds like a guy who likes to go hiking. He likes to, you know, gaze at the stars. You know, he has a great respect for animals and nature and stuff that.
But here's the thing that bugs me with the whole animal sacrifice thing. You know, I could get people being persecuted and prosecuted for stealing animals and killing them. But, you know, just the fact that it's like, oh my God, it's an animal sacrifice. How many fucking chickens and cows do we run through the meat grinder every fucking day? You know, it's like all of a sudden now nature is this untouchable fucking reverent thing. And, you know, if I mean, you know, personally, I'm not an animal sacrificer, nor do I encourage some behavior or such behavior. But even if a small group of people, you know, took it upon themselves to, upon the equinox, go out in a field in the middle of the night at midnight and slaughter a goat in reverence of some, you know, spirit, or, you know, like at this point in time in our history, North America, where do we have the moral ground to point at them and say, you killed a goat? Well, holy fuck, you know, we've all participated in the slaughter of millions of cows and pigs and chickens over the last fucking few hundred years. It's, you know, that part just floors me, where people, you know, oh, and he killed a goat too. Not only did he listen to Black Sabbath, but he killed a goat, or he killed a sheep. It was like, fuck, you've never had lamb before? Never had mutton?
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's very ironic, and, you know, they actually had a case like this in the movie Devil's Advocate, and, you know, he was a lawyer, like the main character, and he was taking on these cases, and one of them was about this guy who apparently had sacrificed a goat or whatever. But, you know, the way the lawyer presented it too, portrayed by Keanu Reeves, was that, you know, the whole hubbub over this whole thing wasn't the fact that he killed a goat. It was the manner of which he killed it, right? I mean, because he killed it due to the way his religion was, you know, his beliefs and everything, and it was taboo to Western society. But, I mean, let's face it, you're still doing the exact same thing that happens to hundreds of millions of animals every day. I mean, actually, I think it's even more disgusting what happens at a lot of these places. Like, I've seen these farms. Like, I mean, you Google this stuff, the whole internet's at your fingertips now. But I mean, you know, they got some pigs that are literally like put in a cage, and they don't have enough room to move, and they're literally overfed their whole life until they die, just in this cage, not able to move. Like, what kind of a life is that? Right? I mean, you want to talk about inhumane. That's inhumane.
That's how I feel about me and my computer chair sometimes. But you know, you get back onto point. You know, I mean, this is a you know, you said earlier, you know, a somewhat Lovecraftian tale, and it certainly is. You know, we have the elements of this wild, untamed wilderness, you know, an environment that seems to spring out from eons past, and a gathering of people around a bonfire. You know, that's a very visceral experience for anybody who hasn't been at a bonfire. And I mean, I know you probably have. I mean, we in the city that we grew up in, I mean, we literally had a night called Bonfire Night.
I used to love that night. And the free hot dogs.
The whole city would gather and create just, you know, a building-sized fire.
Yeah, and there was free hot dogs and Pepsi, and they had fireworks. Yeah, and fireworks.
And fireworks.
And I remember one time one landed on the ground and actually kind of shook stuff. It was pretty cool.
but it's a very visceral experience. It's something that comes way out of the past, and I actually, I'll get into something that's way off topic for this, but I was contemplating why I enjoy smoking so much. I've smoked cigarettes, and I smoke tobacco pipe, and I just enjoy inhaling burning plant material. I love campfires. I love stove fires, like a cast iron stove. I love cigarettes and
Fireplaces.
tobacco pipe, fireplaces, that kind of thing. And I was really wondering, like, why would I love that? And it makes perfect sense. You think of early man, 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, huddled, your little family group huddled around a fire in the darkness. The day's deeds are done. All the work that would be done is done. Everyone's gathered together. You're cooking meat. You have the kinship, the closeness of family. You have the safety of your circle, your circle of family and friends. The safety of the light and the warmth that this fire gives off, and all the while you're inhaling burning plant material. And I mean, how many thousands of years did human beings do that? Gather around a fire, and in the process of all these things that we love to do, sing, tell stories, share food, share comfort, share warmth. I mean, from the very moment that you become aware, that would be your single greatest source of comfort would be this situation. And I think that smoking and, whether it be pipe or cigarettes or whatever, gathering around a campfire, that kind of a situation, that really harkens back to something that's instinctual and deeply embedded in us. And, I really get a sense of that with Dan's story. And, it's like the very act of doing this, this group of people with their primitive weapons. And, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that they were probably, imbibing more than just alcohol, probably smoking more than just cigarettes, enjoying the bounty of the earth and all that she has to give us. And, they're out in the woods, and they're laughing and howling and eating and drinking and smoking and imbibing all these things in reckless abandon. And it's like the very act of this alone is enough to draw these beings out of the depths of prehistory. I mean, it almost kind of harkens back to what I touched upon in our last podcast when I spoke about, a time thousands of years ago, when mankind shared this world with other people-like beings, and we do so no longer. But we seem to have forgotten that time. And like I said before, perhaps in these far dark regions of the world, deep underground, subterranean places, or far off wild locales, we still have a survival of certain unknown, dark, and hidden things.
Well, the interesting, I mean, especially when I hear you say it like that, I have a lot of fond memories of camping with friends. When I was younger, we'd have a fire, and as you said, we'd drink, we'd smoke, and of course, where we camp. I'm not going to say it here, but anyway.
Yeah, because everybody would know where that is.
Well, they could Google it and find it, and I'm sure there's some people that want to kill me. But anyway, it was remote. It's out of the city. And for anybody who lives in the city, by the way, especially the bigger city, if you've never been, away from that, like really out in nature, it is so much darker at night. In fact,
what a shock to the system. I couldn't imagine growing up my whole life in a big city. I mean, we grew up in a small city that became smaller the older we got. But for anybody growing up who grew up in a big city, with all the lights and the sounds and the comfort. The only predator you have to worry about is man.
Yeah, it's so different. Like, not only is it way darker, it's way quieter. Like, you can hear the crickets, you can hear every little
off streams, just
and there's something about it. Like, it's different. You can see the sky in a way that you could never see in the city with all the light pollution. In fact, anyone who uses telescopes, when I used to have one, I mean that was what I did. I would drive to a place outside of the city so I could actually get a really good look at the night sky.
And I mean, let's face it, Corner Brook is a small city. It's small enough now that it's back to town status.
Yeah.
But I literally weep for anybody who hasn't looked upon the Milky Way with their naked eye.
Oh yeah.
If you have only seen the Milky Way on pictures and of special filtered photographs, anybody who's listening to this right now who has never experienced true wilderness and true darkness and true silence of the deep country, think about it. Plan a trip where you can just get the far as you can away from civilization and to find a way to I mean, I grew up hunting, fishing, boating in nature. And I honestly, I live in a big city now with over 1 million people, and what a difference, what an experience. Well, it truly did enrich my life. And I think, in a lot of ways, Dan's story, it nails on a lot of very primal points. Here we have a group of people, almost like a small tribe on this outcropping of rock, surrounded by darkness, surrounded by predators in the dark. And I think that not only is that a tale as old and older than man, that, I think that, to put it in the words of Lovecraft, that there have been, on occasion, a series of strange survivals of things that have lingered from primeval times and have uneasily walked with us in the shadows to our current millennia.
Well, I think in remote places,
and Ontario is fucking huge. It is it takes like days to drive across that province. It is massive. And Canada as a whole is, the majority of our listeners are from the US. I mean, people from the UK aren't really going to get it. Those of you listening from Australia, perhaps, parts of Europe for sure. But, from the UK, from England and that area, you could never understand the vast tracts of absolute unpopulated wilderness that exist in this country of Canada. I feel blessed. We have a landmass almost the size of the United States of America, but our population is what, like a fifth?
Oh yeah, it's not even close. And
I live in a very populated province. I mean, I live in a very populated city, a very populated province, Calgary, Alberta. I mean, they call this the New West. It's oil country up here, baby. There's progress and civilization everywhere. But I myself, in the 10 years I've been here, I've hopped in a car and driven for just a couple of hours. And a couple of hours, you're in the middle of fucking nowhere. It's unreal how much space, So when people start talking about, oh no, we've discovered it all. Have we? Have you ever gone the fuck outside? Like, if for anybody who says we've discovered it all, come to Canada. Even the U.S. I mean, Jesus Christ, what a dirty size of a country, right? You drive for a couple of hours, and you're in the middle of nowhere. You know, the area of the Appalachian Mountains have been populated for hundreds of years, but there are so many backwater, dark corners of this North American continent that, I mean, I'm honestly no way surprised when we receive stories of this. And people talk about, Bigfoot, and I mean, to really get into it, when you really have to look at the North American tales, the Native American stories of all these beings. I mean, these people didn't just make shit up. I mean, the Constitution of the United States of America, in its earliest form, was based upon agreements that North American, Native American, Indigenous American tribes, these agreements that they had with one another. I mean, this was an advanced and thoughtful people. This was a country, Canada and the United States, because there was no separation back then. They were populated by a myriad of different people and different cultures that waged both love and war upon one another. And though they didn't invent the wheel or metalworking or writing, they still had very advanced forms of culture. And I mean, luckily, to this very day, we have at least surviving fragments of their culture. I mean, it's an absolute disgusting situation that we're in now, where so much of that culture has been completely lost, because the majority of it, majority means almost all, but I'm just trying to emphasize how much has been lost. The destruction of the Native American peoples is tantamount to the burning of the Library of Alexandria. We lost just as much or more with the destruction of indigenous cultures, all the way from Alaska to the depths of fucking Mexico, between the American settlers and the Spanish conquistadors. And we look at the tales that they have to give us. These giant flesh-eating cannibal people, and in here in this modern day, these stories are still arising, and you really have to ask yourself, what's the genesis of those early stories? Are these just people who, live and die by nature? I mean, they literally live in the woods. They do what Dan, we heard Dan's story and how amazing that was. What a fantastic way to grow up. I mean, I'd say that I'm envious, other than the fact that I grew up very similarly. Yeah. Thankfully.
And like in modern times, I mean, comparing, where we're to right now, because I was outdoors a lot too, and did a lot of, I still take trips out of town and into like hiking trails and stuff like that, and of course I love camping and being out in the night. Compare that to now. I mean, everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got a computer, everybody's watching TV, everybody goes to work, everybody goes to and they're in traffic, and you go to the mall, there's people everywhere, there's noise everywhere, and even when you're home and it's quiet, you have constant ways to distract yourself with your phone. Oh, a notification. Oh, an email. Oh, I got to go on my computer. Oh, I got bills to pay. But when you're outside town and you're not clutching onto your cell phone, you're camping, you're hiking, it's like time stops, right? And it's only then that you can really take in all these things that you take for granted or don't notice because you're too busy dealing with just the monotony and craziness and the hustle and bustle of regular life now. And honestly, I really miss a lot of the outdoorsy stuff I did when I was younger, and just like Dan, I mean, we would go out, we would have campfires, we would, and it was spooky, like sometimes stuff would happen. You're more in tune to the environment around you, and yeah, I know you can pick up on stuff, and a lot of the times it's just the wind or whatever, but even just to bring that atmosphere in, right? Just to sometimes it's fun to get a little spooked. It's fun to get, you don't get that at home, because you're not in an environment that, promotes that. You're in an environment that promotes distracting yourself with going on the internet, checking email, checking your Facebook, checking, what can I buy? It's just, you don't appreciate it. And that's something that I enjoyed when I read Dan's story, was that kind of takes me back a little bit. Not that I was in a cabal or
you weren't a demon worshiper, monster hunter.
Yeah, and I didn't carry around swords or anything, but
Well, what do you think about that though? The creatures, the way that they were described.
It does. It definitely left an impression on Dan. What I find really interesting, and I think about this quite a bit, as you said, like, the world is vast, right? Like, we think of the world and we think, oh, we have it so populated, we have people everywhere, there's not enough room for all the people and stuff we have, right?
We got cameras and trail cams and satellites.
Yeah, but the truth is, there's so much land that is nature. I mean, if you have ever watched the Blu-ray for Planet Earth, there's crazy amounts of land that you can see in that's like uninhabited by humans, and
not just uninhabited, but nearly untouched.
Exactly,
and maybe definitely untouched in our modern time.
So I mean, these creatures like cryptids, Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, these multitudes of different creatures, whatever it was that Dan saw, perhaps dozens more. Very possible. I mean, there could be tribes of these creatures out. I mean, we're not talking one. I mean, people talk about these creatures sometimes like, oh, there's one Bigfoot, there's one. I would hazard a more plausible explanation is that there are, a race of these things. It might not be obviously not as big as the human race, but there must be a pack of them that have been able to survive throughout all these years. And I'm sure that if that's the case, they're probably out in some remote place that we haven't touched. What was it like? It wasn't too many years ago. Humans have discovered a race of people that had never interacted with the outside world, right?
Had lived the way that they are living now for thousands of years.
So, I mean, there is much more to the world, that we don't know about, that I don't think that we allow to exist in our modern minds. We just assume that.
Well, we tend to want to believe. I mean, everybody wants to believe that they're superior. And when we think of ourselves as a people, as a race, too often we break ourselves down into ever increasingly small tribes. My country versus your country. Not even that. My color versus your color. My religion versus your religion. My country versus your country. Then you break it down even further. We have these, depending on where you live, we have these state and provincial rivalries, and then within the states and the provinces, the cities within those states and provinces have rivalries. And then within those cities, it's like West Side for life, yo. East Side.
Well, geez, look at sports. This sport versus my team, and this sport versus your team and that sport. Or
perfect example of modern tribalism.
Even video games. I like this system, and the system you like is retarded, and you're stupid if you like it. And
the whole red versus blue.
yeah, and it's just is ridiculous. It's like, well, we all like games. Why can't we just all, be a group of people who likes games? Because you're stupid. Because you like this one, and it's like nobody can live and let live, right?
So is it any wonder that in the year 2015 AD that human beings consider itself the only version of Homo sapien or Homo anything to exist? I mean, we have a whole. You can go to any fucking museum or museum of natural history, or just Google it and look. Just go and look. I encourage everybody to go and look. Look at the number of different types of humanoid creatures. The people that came after apes, but before us and during us that existed. I mean, there's a list is longer than my arm. I'm a big guy. I have a long arm. That exists. This list exists of all these different types of people that once lived on this planet. So when somebody tells me, and I mean, I live in a place where it is very heavily populated with Native American peoples. And I have heard so many stories from all kinds. I make a point of asking. That's why I've heard so many, because, I'm a weirdo and I ask people questions, especially questions about, things that are different. And I've heard so many stories of beings that are like people, but not quite people. They're like us, but they're different. Walk on two legs and have two arms and two eyes and the whole anthropomorphic form. So when I have, when I come across a story like Dan's, and I must say, Dan, big shout out to you. Beautifully written. Definitely keep taking those creative writing classes or whatever it is you're doing, because it's a fantastic story, very well written. So often we have just absolute garbly gook submitted to us. It has to be completely rewritten for mass consumption. But this is a beautifully crafted tale, and it really illustrates the level of mystery and unknowable corners that still exist in our modern age. I mean, let's face it, people. We've spent the last several thousand years perfecting what it means to be inside. We've perfected being separate from nature, because nature, is beautiful and all that, but the natural world, it seems like it's trying to kill you at every turn. It's too hot, you die of thirst. It's too cold, you die of hypothermia. You're starving, you get a disease, you get eaten by an animal, and you fall and hurt yourself. So instead, we've perfected inside, and we've put a name on it. We've called it civilization. And it's great. It's fantastic. I love technology. I love civilization. I love satellites and space-faring technology and all that really advanced quantum computers and nanotechnology and metamaterials and all the things connected to all of that. But it's very important to every once in a while to step outside of that and to reconnect where we have come from. And, more often than not, people have these quote unquote spiritual experiences. And it's this reconnecting with the world around us, the world that we came from, that we scraped and scrabbled and pulled ourselves up out of the darkness of prehistory. When it comes to, last ice age, that's it. Like, anything before the Ice Age, we have no clue. Just fossil record and layers of dirt and dust and bones and rocks. And after that, at some point, we established writing and cave painting and that kind of thing. And we have at least a periodic record, sporadic as it may be. But the dimness of pure prehistory seems to indicate that, there was a world full of fantastic creatures and fantastic people. Gigantopithecus, Smilodon, woolly mammoth, mastodons, giant pigs the size of fucking bears, beavers the size of bears. It was a world, a gigantic world that existed before the last ice age.
We've isolated ourselves from anything that could be out there anyway. I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's all kinds of pockets where these different creatures could and possibly are, but we've totally looked inwards. I mean, we're very much a race that's only really interested. I mean, as a society, most people, I mean, you're only really interested in your very limited circle of family and friends, and most of people's concerns are literally money and just getting by in society. It's paying your bills. It's and in turn of doing that, to have a roof over your head, to be able to deal with that, you just look forward to things that you can buy to distract you. It's kind of hollow when you think about it.
Well, and that is a good point, is that, certainly, even from, we look back into, Greek history. What's that, like 2,000-3,000 years ago? I'm not sure. I'm bad with those streams of time, but for the last like 3,000 years, we've done our best to create or to maintain this thing we call culture. This mixture of entertainment and religion and literature and art and scientific knowledge and mathematics and architecture. All those things together is this amazing thing that we call human culture. And while modern human culture, is boiled down to, the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon and this popular reality show and this popular reality star, it's a modern variation upon something that we've been working on for thousands and thousands of years. And altogether, it's an amazing and wonderful and eclectic distraction. It's a way for us to I guess, like you said, further remove ourselves from that natural world. And we've been immensely successful at it for the last several thousand years. And every now and then, a story like Dan's creeps up out of the dark corners of our culture to expose the dark corners of our world, to give us a peek into the possible existence of things that lie outside of all of that. Things that don't exist in your BBC documentaries or your Discovery Channel specials. And it really does infect the imagination, and it makes me feel great when I read stuff like this. It really, I'm like a kid at Christmas. I can't get enough of this kind of stuff.
And just to again say that this was a great story. I mean, I told Dan that when he sent it. Must have taken him forever to write it out, but I think we should all take a note from Dan's story here. I mean, there's a lot to enjoy and take in from nature. I think, if anything, that we should take from the story especially if you're interested in, where we come from and the things that we don't know, the unknowns, the mysteries. Maybe we should spend more time in nature. Maybe that means that every once in a while, when you get a chance, driving outside the city, going camping, going on walking trails. And Dan's story, I kind of do that anyway from time to time, but it almost makes me feel homesick. Even though outside the city and into the woods isn't home to me, it almost makes me feel like it's homesick. Like it feels natural to kind of be out there. And I'm going to be doing that soon. So Dan's story has inspired me. As well as literally burnt by industrialization, both inside the city and remote areas. Industrialization had basically taken this town over. There were rocky high hills and mounds and that were blasted wilds, sudden tracts of desert dunes, and dead bleached trees like skeletons as far as the eye could see. It was like an atomic bomb had gone off 1,000 years before. Quite factually, life of all kinds had been decimated there. Plants, animals, entire ecosystems of various sorts murdered by the machineries of the progress that they had made. Death had come to those places, and it looked like that in many places they walked and explored was just a graveyard. So, to the east of Sunrise Valley, there was a massive impact crater lake, for which there were all kinds of stories, some by the native First Nations peoples, some not. The weather over that lake could suddenly and viciously change, which he had experienced firsthand on a few occasions, coming close to the watercraft we were in and nearly getting swamped and drowned by the sudden change in weather. He said there are known, scientifically proven gravitational and magnetic anomalies surrounding the valley and the lake. The depth of it is listed as not specifically known. It's known to be very, very deep, and many people had died there. A native First Nations community right now lives on its shores. So to Dan, the land was beautiful and fascinating, even in its desolation, and he explored it very much so. In fact, from what I gather, I've seen some of Dan's postings. I have him on my Facebook. He seems to do a lot of exploring. It's one of his things. And so, he was very fascinated by this strange, kind of creepy, but yet beautiful landscape. And he said Sunrise Valley was a mix of farming, greenery, vegetation, and the scars of industrialization. It was and is, which he was to learn later on, a dark blot in his family's history, which, for whatever reason, he would be the one to uncover, partially through the use of psychics and mediums that came into the city core years later, barely tolerated and heavily marginalized. Because of this family history, there was a shadow and a sorrow, bitterness that ran through his family following him from the old place where he came from. He developed an interest in what he'll call the esoteric, right from his earliest memories, which his family looked down upon, by the way. And he became, compared to any other children that he knew of in the town, very knowledgeable in this esoteric knowledge. And he spent a lot of time out in the wilderness and the hills, wandering the woods for hours and hours at a time, and becoming quite strong and sometimes unkempt looking in the process. All these facts very quickly put a mark on his head, because in many ways, by basically everybody he knew, including his own family, he became the black sheep. Or as he put it, perhaps the black goat would be a more proper term. He had a small group of friends, the eclectic weirdo, bookworm pack of the town, but they were in it for the adventure and fun. They enjoyed these strange adventures. And they were curious people. They wanted to poke and prod. They wanted to explore. Dan said he was in it for much more than that. He was marginalized even among these strange group of people. but they gave him a small, tight tribe to be part of, so he suffered through it, and there were many conflicts and infighting within that pack because of that, but, more or less it was better for him. So because of all these factors, and because he lived a very, very secretive life, like some of the things that he delved into that was esoteric, he was kind of, in a little bit of a way, a black sheep, I guess, within his group of friends. He said later in his teens, fill out the form, hit submit, we'll get it on the website and into a podcast. And with that having been said, we're going to jump into Dan Omega's story. By the way, on the website, it's called Subterranean Predator. So, if you want to read it there, that's the title. And now we're going to start. So, as Dan puts it, he grew up in an extremely small town on the fringes of northern Ontario wilderness. When the town, of course, was still in its infancy, and for all intents and purposes, barely out of its pioneering days. He has to keep the name of this town private, and for reasons that he'll outline, and I'll read that as we get to it. But he's going to call the city, or reference the city in this story, as the city of Southern Cross. The outskirt town within which he lived was called, and again, this is a quoted name, I guess fictitious, Sunrise Valley. And he said the entire town is a low-lying valley basin. Country roads, dirt roads, roads that went to nowhere and stopped as dead ends to be continued as trails into the woods and forest. Many of them generations old and from the settlement days of horses and wagons. Many paved roads had lights spread far apart with huge gaps in between. Much of it, in pockets, looked like vestiges of frontier towns of the Old West. A lot of dust, dirt, and gravel in those stretches. There were ghost towns and the husks of old structures and buildings and old foundations here and there. It was largely rural outside of the city proper and again surrounded by huge tracts of wilderness, the remains of old farms dotting the landscape. Like I said, he wrote this really well. So at this time, he said he lived in north of Southern Cross, again a fictitious place or name for the place, but which was also very small and barely developed. And this was in one of the satellite towns. Much of the region, extreme Canadian Shield landscape, all around the main city, like an epicenter, was barren, blighted, and scourged.
Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we continue with our cryptid submissions. This one is sent in by Dan Omega. Actually came in on July 26th. Excellent stories. Actually sounds somewhat Lovecraftian at parts. Very well written. So we're going to jump into his story. And believe me, it's quite a tale. And before we do that, though, if you have an effed up story of your own and you'd like to submit that and get it into a podcast, go to effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the submissions link. Also, geologically very complex. A landscape of very strange contrasts and often has a strange feel to it, with ancient creek beds cutting through it. Underground caverns of all kinds are known to exist beneath it, some of which are accessible, and most are not accessible by normal means. You would find anomalous spots in areas that were completely foreign to everything around in the middle of nowhere. Quite literally, it was a plot of land like a separate drop in the wilds around it. You'd find yourself in a lush, steamy, jungle-like site with a rich swamp or pond when surrounding it with a near visible boundary, marking where the rest of nature continued. Or in the forest, straight of like a fairy tale, you would stumble upon a sand dune in the middle of all of it. By this, you just stumble into this thing that would be all around these narrow desert brush. The wild woods to the north were deep, and what he said are truly boreal forests. But so this is setting the stage. This is the place where he lives. So getting to his story, he moves out to the Sunrise Valley, which is in the middle of the Southern Cross place, and he was 6 when they first moved there, and they moved because he almost died on his birthday in an accident right around where he lived, and I guess they just needed to start over, and they apparently had to change his name. They had to protect his identity. Anyway, so he was there. He said that his grandparents had come from the old country, Slavic Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, etc. He was surrounded with the feeling of the old country and the old ways, old traditions, foods, gardening, fruits, vegetables, herbs, roots, spices, wild berries, and then, of course, vast miles of wilderness to explore with wild abandon. Superstitions and folklore were rife in his bloodline. There had also been a history to his family which had been partially hidden and partially forgotten.